Again, we're presenting this today too, but to recognize Dr. Pollitt, Sarah, Dr. Christofa, and Karin as well too, so you can see the real contributors to get us to this calibration and to the work that we're able to highlight and talk about today would not be here without their efforts and their contributions. So we want to do a really brief recap again of where this work has been, building on the first two sessions, just as a kind of a brief touch. We wanted to break this into 3 separate sessions because we do think that it is a bit of content, and to some degree might be really kind of a new way of thinking or a new way of engaging with data in relation to the work that you do. So in the last 2 webinars, we've made the case and talked a lot about how when we set our policy and planning practices, they have effects on a variety of different things, so whether it be urban design, the actual infrastructure, how we treat green space. We've talked about when in doing so that there's a connection between those conditions, those environmental conditions and policies that we set up, and the behavior we see people engage in, whether or not they're going to walk, take active transportation, or whether or not they might drive or actually use outdoor spaces. We have, as we design a transportation system, it has an effect on those behaviors. Those behaviors in turn then play a role in certain pathways that are connecting to people's health outcomes. And we really began to focus, while there's a number of them, we really began to focus on motor vehicle crashes, air pollution, and physical activity, thinking those things through. And if you recall, the way then we've talked about that is that both impacting people's daily lives and what that means in terms of whether or not they're living with a disability or living with some type of illness or sickness, the fact that they may die earlier than we would think, so premature mortality, but then also those things that may result directly in death. And so we're thinking about those pieces. We've made that connection again to thinking about how the environment affects behavior, affects exposure, and affects health outcome. And we can think about that work all the way across. And we can look and begin to quantify what do those changes look like and whether or not they're leading to conditions that are more conducive to healthier outcomes and wellness, or whether or not they're conducive to injury, disease, and potentially death. We touched on this in the last session, that a key piece in doing the modeling and thinking about this is the use of the relative risk. And at the end of the day, the relative risk is telling us how likely is someone to experience an adverse or poor health outcome to a potential positive health outcome when you compare populations based on their exposures and the behaviors that they can engage in. So really a key piece of us being able to look at how likely or more likely someone is to engage or potentially experience a poor or positive health outcome. Last week too, we also talked about these various inputs that really kind of play key factors within ITHIM. What does the population look like? What is the current disease burden within the population? What are the various travel data inputs that we can put into a model? How can we quantify physical activity levels, both kind of transportation related, but also non-transportation related? What's exposure like in terms of air pollution that people are finding in their environment? And then what extent do people potentially experiencing injuries now, and how might that be changed? And we frame these up as key inputs to ITHIM, and the fact that they can give us an understanding of where we are now as we do that calibration. But then it then sets us up to do these scenarios where either based on goals we're setting, based on outputs from a different transportation or other kind of model, it gives us the ability to play through some scenarios and look at the difference between what our baseline is and how that would change from a health perspective, either positively or negatively, or if you recall in some cases a balance of both as we think about other scenarios. That gives us those comparator results that we can then begin to work from and adjust how we might make investments, the type of conditions that we want to set in the world, and think about the connections that they have. Which brings us to, I think, to where we were beginning to leave off last week too, is that we've had this wonderful opportunity brought to us here in Massachusetts where we're able to kind of calibrate that information to the MPO level, a place that's very familiar, I think, with long-range transportation plans, with thinking about scenarios that operating at a population scale where you can really see these effects as you look across large numbers of people in different communities. And so that's information that we're lucky to have with us today too. So hopefully that just gives you kind of a quick arc of where we've been in terms of that recap of making those connections from policy and physical environment conditions to the health outcomes that we see, the ways by which we can get there, thinking about things like relative risk and making comparisons, and then giving you the geographies that we might be able to work at too. as Betsy mentioned earlier, we'll make sure that we bring back those recordings in case you want to refresh yourself. But we have a really great opportunity to see some of that in action now. So I'm going to turn it over to Sharon for a moment to kind of facilitate us into the next part of the webinar.
Yeah, so hello all. I want to provide you all a peek under the hood of ITHIM. I sent, or Casey sent to you last week, a set of spreadsheets that was the ITHIM tool as the user guide and a couple of tutorial scenarios that could talk you through using the tool yourself. So what we're going to do today shouldn't be a supplement for either the tutorials or exploring the user guide yourself, but really give you a snapshot of what it looks like to think through, okay, what kind of scenario do I have? What kind of data do I need to use ITHIM given that scenario? And where should I go in the workbook to modify the tool to take my data? So first is, Barry, next slide, please. Revisiting the idea that ITHIM takes 3 different types of scenarios. The one that we looked at last week was user-defined, mobility-based. But ITHIM can be used to understand the health impacts of all 3 different types of scenarios. So we're going to explain the other 2, which is the user-defined health-based and also predefined. And as I go through these 3, I'll point to where you can modify the ITHIM workbooks to model the health impacts of these 3 different types of scenarios. Next slide. So again, the inputs that you get to put into ITHIM can come from a variety of different sources. These include aspirational or goal-based, more of like what we were looking at last time, that green DOT vision statement. But it can also come from the literature. It can come from the outputs of a different type of modeling process, or it could come from your scenario planning models. However, the type of input data you have is going to be intricately linked with the type of scenario that you're going to be using in ITHIM, and will impact how you modify the ITHIM tool. Next slide. So the example that we looked at outputs from last week was that middle one, the user-defined mobility-based. And this allows the inputs of mode shift as described through multipliers, ratios, to look at the health impacts of that. Again, in the case of last week, we looked at what would happen if we tripled the number of biking and walking trips, assuming that these are substituted from car trips. User-defined health-based similarly allow us to take inputs that we can find aspirationally or in the literature about what is the change to daily physical activity from active transportation. So the example here, if we know that a first or last mile improvement increases mean daily capita active transportation by 15 minutes, what are the health impacts of that? But we could also look at something aspirational, such as what if all folks in a certain area were to get the recommended daily activity from their daily physical activity levels from active transportation? Predefined is the one that Barry just referenced, where you're using outputs from other modeling processes as inputs into ITHIM. So the example that we have here comes from Sacramento, California, where they use their travel demand model under a sustainable community strategy scenario to predict what does this new amount of walking and biking is associated with in terms of health impacts. Next slide. So no matter your scenario type, the areas for user action within ITHIM is pretty isolated to 3 main tabs. And so I'm going to quickly introduce you to those tabs. And as we go through the different scenarios, you'll see that different parts of them get played with for different types of scenarios. But the workbooks that you guys got should have been isolated down to the 5 action tabs, as I would call them. But note that the full ITHIM workbook has around 35 odd tabs. And you can see all of them. If you right click on the bottom and say unhide tab, you'll see sort of in my screenshot here that there are additional tabs that perhaps were not in the versions that we sent you. But again, just noting that all user action really happens on a total of 5 tabs. So the first of those tabs is the travel scenarios tab. And this is a screenshot from it. If you hit next one, the type of activity that you would do here is you could select a scenario of interest for comparison to your, and if you were doing a predefined, or if you click next, once more. You can also modify the tables here for health or mobility-based scenario. And there's another table actually further down, which is not popping up in a green box, but can also be further modified. Next slide. Oh, there's the pop-up box. Next slide, yes. So the other activity, the tab where user action can focus on is the user options tab. And screenshot from my user options tab. And so most frequently, you're going to visit this tab to define the scenario you wish to model in comparison to that calibrated baseline data. So if you click once, Barry. And that's going to take place in that blue dash box up there. So you're going to choose user for user base or predefined for predefined, or you could just compare baseline to baseline. So those are the 3 options for that tab. If you click again. This sheet is also further modifiable if you want to play with some more advanced settings. So the default for this selection is 1, but in this box, you can select the source of benefit and or harm. So 1 represents PM 2.5 and physical activity combined, but you could also select to look at only air pollution or only physical activity alone. So that allows you some additional modifiability of the outputs that you're going to get. And if you push next again, this table down here allows you to modify some further more advanced settings. And all of that's described in the user guide. So I'm not going to get too into that right now. Next slide. So diving into our different scenarios, we'll begin with the one that's the most familiar to us, the user-defined mobility-based. Next slide. So as we looked at last time, the scenario question informing what type of inputs that we need to put into ITHIM. So you'll see here that there's 4 listed, but if you remember from last week, we ended up not using bullet point 3 or 4. So the per capita minutes of riding transit or car VMT per day of electric vehicles. We chose to leave those at the level that they were calibrated for the baseline model, and we chose to focus our changes on 1 and 2. So this is all to say, when you look at ITHIM and you know that this is the type of scenario, you have to have considerations for all of these inputs, but you don't necessarily have to change all of these inputs. Next slide. So if you were to have a user-defined mobility-based scenario, you would go to the travel scenarios sheet, next slide, and you would navigate to the area of the sheet that's circled in blue right here. Not going to go into detail about each one of these lines. This is meant to be more of a visual guide of where you might go in ITHIM if this is the type of scenario, but note that there's a limited amount of data that you're actually modifying in the ITHIM workbook for this type of scenario. And you can see this, I know that the screen is pretty small, but if you could zoom in, you could see that there are the ratios, and this is set up from when we were doing our scenario. So you have that 3 times multiplier entered for walking and biking, and underneath that, the 1 saying that we weren't changing transit activity at all. Next slide. So if you were to have a user-defined health-based, you would go to a different part of the ITHIM workbook, and this is largely because you're using different types of inputs. So next slide. So as a reminder, when we're looking at user-defined health-based, we're looking at changes in the time that people are getting physically active. And you can either look at that in terms of mean or median. And the inputs that you'll need for that are related to mean daily minutes of activity. And there's different types which are described in that green box there. And you also can consider deciding the proportion of those trips that will be done by bicycles specifically. Next slide. So if you were to have a user-defined health-based scenario, you would again go to that travel scenario sheet, which should be very familiar by now. Next slide. And you would scroll down and you would find this table. And circled in blue here, you will see the areas where you can enter those 3 inputs that we just described. So you're modifying the daily per capita minutes of active transportation, not related to transit, per capita minutes of transit using transit, and bike share minutes. And next, I'll note here that this describes how you might change mean. Median actually involves a couple of extra steps. So I would urge you, if you're interested in looking at median, return to that user guide because it describes all of this in great detail and also explains how you could do this for a median change. Next slide. So for predefined scenarios, these are the types of scenarios, again, where you're taking outputs from other types of models and putting them into ITHIM to look at the impact on health. Next slide. So the inputs that you're going to use here are those that you might be familiar with from a transportation demand model. And I will note, I'm not going to read you all these because there's a lot, but noting that what we're looking at is for inputs related to drivers, passengers, bikes, buses, rail, walkers, and other. And that these are going to be, typically would come out of a travel demand model, but you could also have some of these be aspirational or literature based if you didn't have them. So 31, next slide. So for this type of data, you will actually use the 3rd modifiable tab, which I didn't mention before, which is the scenario data sheet. And the reason I didn't mention it before is because it only is really used with these predefined data scenarios. And next slide. You will be entering your model outputs into those blue circles and naming your scenario in the green circle. And where you enter the data is pretty straightforward. You can see next to that green circle, there's a bunch of different, they're all titled, and they'll be clear about which type of data you're going to be entering in each one of those rows. Next slide. So once you've entered all of your data, you go back to that trusty travel scenario sheet. Next slide. And instead of modifying any of the tables here, you just choose the name of the scenario that you just entered in that yellow box, and it will be updated as your predefined scenario. Next slide. So that was a whirlwind introduction to ITHIM and the different scenarios that you use for ITHIM, the different types of data you might use for ITHIM, and where you go in the tool to modify it to reflect those outcomes. So again, I encourage you all, if you have further interest in this, to turn to that user guide that the researcher team put together that provides all of this in greater detail. But we're just trying to get you thinking a little bit about like what types of scenarios and what types of data you need to use and play with ITHIM on your own. And before I hand it over, I also want to share what those last two tabs that you can modify are, because if you remember on the top, I mentioned that there are 5 main tabs. The last 2 are related to output. Next slide. The first of which is the travel summary tab, which has all of your outcomes related to the baseline and the comparison scenarios of interest in terms of travel outcomes. Next slide. So here you will see different types of graphs that allow you to visually perform different types of comparisons. For example, in the top right, you can compare trends of distance traveled for all modes simultaneously. But as you saw in the previous slide, there's also a table up top. So if you wanted to play with any of the data, make your own data visualizations, that's an option too. But this tab is really nice because it provides a lot of those initial types of comparisons quick, and you can scroll through and get a feeling for how your scenario is impacting travel behavior. Next slide. The final slide that you will probably turn to is the health summary slide. And similar to the travel summary slide, this health summary slide has all the health-related outcomes. The table we are looking at right now has disease burden stratified by sex and age. Next slide. But this tab also has these tabulated disease burden results presented graphically. Here you are seeing it in terms of deaths and DALYs shown by risk factor to facilitate a quick inspection of changes implicated by these different transportation scenarios. But again, these graphs are meant for that sort of quick inspection, but if you are interested in diving in more, the tables above have a summary of all the different disease calculation tabs up there for you to explore a little bit more visualization. Next slide. Also in this tab includes a summary of detail related to injuries and serious and fatal injuries attributed to both active and non-active travel modes for baseline and your comparison scenarios. So if you wanted to dig in a little bit deeper into the accident values, you have that data in the health summary as well. Next slide. So with that, I'm going to pause. So noting that, to summarize what we just discussed, there are 5 main tabs that you're going to need to know how to modify ITHIM for at least these initial applications of ITHIM. Hopefully that walkthrough was helpful. We will send out this video again so you can rewatch any portion of it. But I again encourage everyone to turn to that user guide and the tutorial documents because they talk us through how to modify the spreadsheet in a lot greater detail. So I want to turn it over maybe to Eleni and Krystal to introduce yourself and then opening it up to attendees to ask any questions. I know that the attendees have had these spreadsheets for a few days and I'm imagining some of them have begun to play with it. They might have questions about how to use the tool specifically or just in general about the ITHIM process.
So I can start. As Barry mentioned, I'm Krystal Pollitt. I'm an assistant professor at Yale at the School of Public Health. And I'll let Eleni introduce herself.
Hi, I'm Eleni Christofa. I'm an associate professor in civil and environmental engineering at UMass Amherst. And I guess I'm happy to ask any questions you might have about the scenarios or the health aspects of the model. I think are more Krystal's expertise, but I'll do my best.
And I am going to have to note, I'm sorry, I had a COVID-related.
I wanted to echo.
Sorry, I just wanted to say I will have to jump off just in a moment for a COVID-related issue that's come up. So I apologize, but I will answer any questions that there are around the health-related aspects if there's anything written to me during this webinar.
Great.
The only thing I wanted to add while we're waiting for questions is that I wanted to echo Saren's recommendation to go through the guide. We've tried to write it up very step by step, and we hope it's clear. If not, we'll have to answer questions as you're going through. But I think that's the best way to start, kind of like having the spreadsheet and the guide side by side and go step by step.
If anyone has a question, you can go ahead and raise your hand or type it in the chat box. In the meantime, I'll ask a question. I'm not sure who this is best geared toward, but one thing that I'm curious about is how often the background data is calibrated or should be calibrated. I know that turn on my video, that some of the data does come from the MPO as we run our state's travel demand model. So is there a sense from you as to like how often if we were to get to the point where we felt comfortable updating some of the background data, is that something that we should take the time to do or to learn to do? And if so, like how often might you recommend doing that?
Krystal, do you want to start and then I'll...
Sure. So the calibration is comprised of a number of different variables related to population statistics and also health-related outcomes. So we've done a survey across each MPO that's stratified by age and sex for all the different health outcomes that we do in relation to all of the travel parameters that Eleni can talk about in detail. So yes, there is value in updating it. How much change we would expect to see even over a 5-year periods regarding changes with an incidence of different disease would probably not have too much fluctuation. So I do see some value, but I don't see a very high need for updating it too frequently unless there's some major changes that have ensued within that MPO. Eleni,
So,
do you want to elaborate for the travel?
Yeah, so I was gonna say, I'll start with the safety data. Those are 5-year averages, so I don't expect them, similarly to what Krystal just said, I don't expect them to change much over the next, I don't know, 3-4 years. That's assuming we kind of like ignore the current situation of COVID, because that has affected a lot, as we all know, both the travel patterns and safety data and everything. The other aspect was bus occupancy. Also, I don't think those change a lot, but you know, maybe we should wait another, I don't know, 2-3 years, and we want to update the numbers if things have changed due to this pandemic we're going through. And in terms of the travel demand data, you probably know this better than me. Like when you start saying, you know, when you run the model with updated information and you see when results change a lot. So the new census also might be worth being incorporated at some point. And of course, if we ever have a new travel demand survey, travel household survey for our state, I think that would be important to be included, given that I don't think we've used a lot from the travel survey, but it might inform both the travel demand model and some of the inputs, as it will be more up to date with regards to how micro-mobility modes and shared mobility is used, since the previous data were from 2011, that those modes were not as popular. If you're asking about the sensitivity of the model to each of those inputs, it's something we haven't looked at. It's kind of like the next step we want to work on. Our team wants to work on independently to basically research how much each of those parameters are affecting the model. So we'll keep you posted once we have results on that.
Great, thank you.
Thank you very much. It looks like Bruce raised his hand. Let's see. I'll unmute him. If I can. But I'm having trouble unmuting him. Do you think you can do it?
Yeah.
Oh, there we go.
Hey,
Thank
can
you.
hear me? Is it working? Okay.
Bruce,
Can you hear me?
yep, you're really quiet, but
Can you hear
maybe
me
if you can get closer
better?
to your microphone.
Better?
Yeah.
Better? Okay. So I guess one of the questions I have is, I understand this is being done at the MPO level. Is there a way of customizing this to do it at a different level of geography? Is there a way to disaggregate this? And I ask this because frequently we're called on to do studies at, you know, in corridors or in a specific area, as opposed to on a, you know, kind of master sort of MPO level, and, you know, to really target and see sort of things like, you know, as opposed to overall, you know, for that larger geography, which again could let us, you know, really focus in and see what certain impacts are, as opposed to like, well, you know, this is, you know, it doesn't move the needle that much in the MPO, but in this local community or in this neighborhood, things, you know, things might change. So.
Yeah, that's harder to do due to the lack of data. So some of the data we had, like the air quality data, we're down to, I don't know what it was, 1 by 1 kilometer, I think, of PM 2.5 pollutants. So technically you can do it if you have the data. Although where I'm not sure is how easily you can capture the impact of that model of the project you're thinking about outside the area of interest, and whether that would be important for potentially health outcomes of the you know, surrounding areas.
Right. A way of shrinking it, just, you know, it doesn't have to be at a 1 by 1, shall we say, but, you know, like a town level, or you know, again, a corridor, shall we say, you know, a highway corridor, a transit corridor.
Yeah, I don't see why you couldn't do it if you have the data at a resolution that allows you to just focus on the data. I just haven't seen any implementations of this particular model in areas smaller than the MPO. And I think this is a question that has come up a lot as we've, you know, since, I don't know, we've been working on this, I think, for 2 or 3 years now. So since the beginning we started working, I think that's a common question we've heard, but most of the implementations in the real world of this model have been at the MPO level.
Okay. All right.
Can I add to that real quick?
Thanks. Sure.
We just asked. I think we had touched on this in previous calls, Eleni, which was the idea that you could use like the heat tool or something if you're like kind of a smaller level and just looking at physical activity. I wonder, from your perspective, is there any kind of equivalent that might be helpful to think about from the crash side of things that could help at a smaller scale?
Crash. You know, crashes are, as much as they're like really bad, they're fairly infrequent. So it's hard. And if we start thinking also about, I mean, it also depends on the type, what information we have about crashes and how they're affected by certain parameters is highly reliant on what is the type of project you're looking at. So if you're looking at putting a bike lane, we don't even have that much data, you know, like, so for non-motorized users, those models are not as well developed. There's some recent efforts by the federal government, NCHRP reports that are studying safety performance functions is what we commonly use to predict how many crashes you should expect given a certain improvement you make. But yeah, if you're looking at non-motorized types of improvements, those are not necessarily as accurate given the lack of data, basically. Yeah, I mean, that's the only thing I would recommend if you want to investigate how crashes would change the safety performance functions. The Highway Safety Manual would have some guidance of those.
Thank you.
We also have a question from Kathy typed into the chat box, and she asks, will a major economic downturn affect the model substantially?
I'm assuming the question relates to whether it affects the inputs of the model. So to the extent that it affects travel patterns and travel choices in terms of mode, or travel mile, vehicle miles traveled, then it would affect the outcomes of the model. The model itself wouldn't change, but you would have to update those inputs so they reflect the current situation as the baseline if you want to then assess how an improvement would change those health outcomes. Does it answer the question?
I think so. Kathy, let us know if you have a follow-up or you want clarification on something. It does. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thanks.
Any other questions that folks want to ask?
Yeah.
So just while we're waiting, maybe on another question, I'm curious, Eleni, you and the team too might be a little bit closer, and just wondering if you're seeing anything kind of newly emerging from ITHIM work, either within the US or nationally. I know, for example, like they were trying to move to an R-based model, and there were some other thoughts. And yeah, just wondering if you saw any recent improvements or relevant changes.
I don't have, but I think Karin has been in touch with another MPO. So I'll ask her to share if she has any information. I will email you maybe, and then you can share with the rest. And I think whatever it is probably still in the workings. The latest update I had was the R code you mentioned, that they're trying to streamline this a little bit more. The spreadsheet, if you start going through it, it's fairly complicated. We try to make it, you know, as step by step and as simple as possible, but yeah, so hopefully the R code will be easier to handle, and, you know, just put in your inputs and so on. Yeah, sorry, I don't have any other update on it.
I have another question, actually. I don't know that this probably isn't possible with this particular model, but, you know, and certainly when we're thinking about things like safety in particular and active transportation, we know that land use plays a big role as on whether people can walk safely or bicycle safely, or even do that at all within their neighborhood. So I'm wondering if you have any ideas of whether they're within this work being done around this model, or if any other models out there that kind of takes into account land use, and that's something that we, you know, us and MAPC do in terms of projecting what land use changes are we think will happen in the future. And it's certainly something that plays a big role in transportation impacts. So is there anything
yes, certainly. This model does not take into account land use directly. The only way I can think of incorporating it is if you use the output of a travel demand model that accounts, or an activity-based model that accounts for land use and other community characteristics, then you can use those outputs as input into ITHIM and capture it that way. It does account, though, for safety aspects of increased physical activity. So you'll see if you're if you're increasing, let's say the example that it's my understanding that Sarah presented in the last webinar, if you triple the number of trips by bike and by walking, then you would see that the crashes, the safety injuries and fatal crashes are increasing, but then you also get a benefit from those people walking or bicycling more. So there is a kind of like a trade-off there that you can observe it through the output, the health output of the model. But the land use is not directly accounted for, unless it has been accounted for when you're calculating, what you're estimating the input you will provide to this model through the predefined scenarios.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions?
Very.
Sorry, well, I guess, and so just maybe to kind of bring us back to this current moment, just wondering, Eleni, if you have any ideas, could ITHIM potentially be used to think about what the current moment is in terms of like drop off in vehicle trips, increase in potentially in bicycle and walking trips? I'm trying to think of ways that we may be able to say that let's not lose the gains we may have from the changes in the transportation system at the moment, and just wondering if you might have any reflections on whether the model could do that, or even to think about it that way.
Sorry, I'm not sure I understood the question. So whether the model can assess the current situation with, are you referring to the pandemic, or?
Yeah, sorry, to the pandemic, to that idea that we've had such a significant drop off in vehicle trips, to what extent, and maybe correspondingly, we've seen some greater amounts of physical activity that we could think about. And yeah, maybe it's not possible, but just trying to relate whether or not the transportation changes in the moment could be maybe modeled through ITHIM.
That's something that can certainly be modeled. I mean, you have to make some assumptions if you don't have data, and I know that how many people bike and walk is a rare resource. So if we knew how many people now are walking instead of driving, you can adjust those numbers through that example that Karin presented a little bit more detail in more detail today. So you triple, or it's probably more than triple. I don't know. You say 10 times the number of trips by bike and by walk, and then you assume 100%, let's say, substitution of car trips, because you assume that all those people were driving before. Then you can also adjust. Probably you'll have a multiplier less than 1 for the bus trips to reflect that fewer people are using transit right now. And I don't know if you might have to make an assumption on how that reflects in whether those now drive or walk or not at all. I guess some stay, I mean, a lot of people stay home. So the absolute change in trips of bike, trips of bike, walk, and transit are fairly easy to implement through the user-defined mobility-based scenarios. So you just change those multipliers, and then you make an assumption on how many of those came from car trips. Now, if you want to consider that the total vehicle, that the total demand would change because a lot of people, telecommute or just stay home or don't take their kids to school. I think that would have to be better modeled through a predefined scenario where you can update all the vehicle miles traveled by car, by bike, by whatever the mode is in the vehicle hours traveled spent. Yeah.
Any other questions?
But it would be certainly interesting to do. I think it would show probably positive health outcomes. And maybe the air quality, again, Krystal is the expert to respond on that, but probably the air quality calibration data will have to be updated to reflect that, because of all these vehicles not driving anymore, then the air quality has improved. Again, that if you're changing, like your baseline to compare to an improvement scenario, you would have to update those. Otherwise, the model should be able to capture what the effect is going to be on air quality if you reduce vehicle miles traveled by 50%, let's say. Sorry, I hope that was clear, because there's kind of like two.
Yeah, and I would say that it was quite helpful for me too, because I think in hearing you speak through where you'd be making those changes and what that scenario might look like in the moment was really helpful too. And partly what made me think about it is work Sharon's involved with around ultrafine particulates. They had a mobile van out, I think, in Somerville, and they reported on some of that data last night, and I think it was somewhere between a 25 to 30% drop in what they were collecting in terms of air pollution locally, and it was really impressive to see. And so exactly as you were mentioning.
I wonder what the role, I don't know if this is necessarily how this is integrated in ITHIM, but I wonder what the role of trucks are. They bring up a really good point in the chat about, we're not driving to going to the store as much anymore, so are trucks increasing, and what role would that, changes in that fleet mix that's on the road have on both safety and emissions?
So the vehicle miles traveled by trucks are certainly taken into consideration in the calibrated data. And I guess usually we assume that what project you're trying to assess is not going to cause a change in tracks. Now, if you expect that there is going to be a change in traffic, then you can model that using a predefined scenario, where essentially you assume you have input data that come from a travel demand model, and you incorporate that change that way. And then you can compare it with whatever the baseline is.
Okay, that makes sense. Yeah. A lot to think about. A lot of scenarios, potential scenarios that we can look at. Any other questions?
Yep.
Well, if there are no other questions, Okay, we can wrap up a few minutes early. And certainly, thank you all, Barry and Sharon and Eleni and Krystal for joining us. I think this is really, from my perspective, really promising and really fantastic. And hopefully we can find ways to use this and certainly lighter weight tool than some of the others we've had in the past. So we'll send out, as we've been saying, the materials and the recordings, and I can expect follow-up staff internally from myself and to kind of figure out what our next steps are, because we don't want to lose our momentum on this. And so thank you all, and have a great rest of your day.